Good evening, everyone. Welcome. This has already been a very rich 2 weeks. This is actually my third time in the pavilion. I'm Seni Nafo. I'm the coordinator of the Africa Adaptation Initiative, and we're here to celebrate adaptation. We're here to celebrate adaptation on the continent, and we're also here to celebrate a journey and a partnership together. AAI was launched in Paris 2015 at COP21. And from 2015 on, we've enjoyed collaboration, partnership, friendship from both the UN, UNDP, actually from the UN at the top, from then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to now the Secretary General, and as well as UNDP, as I mentioned. And the EU has been all along, so thank you. We were here also yesterday to hear the launch of the Team Europe initiative on adaptation. So again, we'll continue on that very good note. We also had a few days ago the first AAI steering committee, where the steering committee adopted key documents for the way forward: a 2030 strategy, a 5-year work plan, as well as governance arrangement. And it's important to note that this initiative now, in terms of the composition of the steering committee at the African Union, is probably the only African Union climate initiative which has member states, so countries representing the 5 sub-regions of the continent, but also key organization, and for the first time, civil society organization sitting at the board, at the steering committee, enjoying the same responsibilities and the same rights, as well as subnationals. You would all agree with me that adaptation is local specific, and it can only be dealt with effectively through a bottom-up comprehensive partnership. So we have subnationals, we have civil society organizations, and our partners. Very happy to have such a high esteem panel. COP27 presidency is represented. We've heard His Excellency Minister Shukri telling us over the last 2 weeks, and probably at the beginning of the year and throughout, that this COP is about implementation, this COP is about adaptation, this COP is about advancing concrete action on the ground. So we'll hear from the presidency. We'll hear as well from the Commission, again, recommitting its support to the continent. This is also the year, by the way, this is also the year of the AU-EU summit. So we're continuing on that length, and then we'll have a presentation of the State of Adaptation report by the team, by the AAI team. This is our very own IPCC assessment on adaptation. So the State of Adaptation report is an assessment, but it's an assessment from the lens of African experts, African perspectives on all the work which has already taken place. So we'll hear from our distinguished panel on that as well. With no further ado, we'll start with our President, Your Excellency Said Al-Rais. You have the floor. Bravo. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Seni, and it's a real pleasure being with you all here today. Adaptation, the importance of adaptation to Egypt and to the continent simply cannot be overstated. And I think this is abundantly clear from all of the statements made and the interventions made by COP President Minister Shukri. Of course, the embodiment of this importance, one of the embodiments of this importance is the Africa Adaptation Initiative. And of course, the issue of adaptation is very near and dear to the hearts of not only Egyptians, but also Africans in general, and of course to the entire population of the world. So with regard to the Africa Adaptation Initiative itself, I just wanted to highlight a couple of points. First, of course, to thank Seni for his excellent efforts so far in heading the technical support unit of the initiative. It's off to a great start. We're making headway, as he said. The steering committee meeting was held quite recently, and really hitting the ground running. And of course, I also wanted to say a word of thanks to His Excellency, the President of Gabon, President Ali Bongo, the AAI champion, for his visionary leadership of this initiative and the concrete steps that he has taken to turn it into a reality. And also to say that for Egypt, AAI is also very special because in 2015, Egypt was, in fact, and the President of Egypt, His Excellency President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, was heading or chairing the Committee of African Heads of State on Climate Change, or the CAHOSC. And the AAI, along with another very important initiative for the continent, the Africa Renewable Energy Initiative, were launched. So for us, we're very proud of this initiative, and we're also very proud of the fact that this initiative will in fact be hosted here on Egyptian soil in the Office of United Cities and Local Governments of Africa in Cairo. And this combination is a testament to something very important, which is that adaptation is crucial at the local level. It really does need to be from the ground up in order to have meaningful effects and meaningful results for those who are on the front lines of climate change. And this is the intent really behind the AAI, the Africa Adaptation Initiative, and we very much look forward to continuing to build from strength to strength for this initiative and to actualize the very lofty ambitions that we have set forward for it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for sharing the perspectives as well as the Egyptian leadership over the years. I was just reminded a few days ago when I shared the panel with Minister Yasmin Fouad. In 2015, I actually traveled 11 times to Cairo to work on the design of both the Africa Adaptation Initiative and the Renewable Energy Initiative. And Minister Fouad, then Assistant Minister, was the counterpart on the Egyptian side. And she was reminding me of those countless hours of work and days of work, and finally getting it to fruition and getting the initiative now launched back, coming back home to Cairo, Al Dunya, Mother of the World. Thank you very much. Diana, this is also the second time we find ourselves on the panel. Thank you again for the support of the European Union over the years, for the continent, for climate change, and for adaptation. You have the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everybody. And yes, as you said, this COP has indeed been a journey. For me, actually, it's the first journey because it's my first COP, certainly not the last. And I really, it's hard work, but I really enjoyed being here and learning so much from all the great practitioners of climate action that you can meet here on the ground. Now, I don't want to repeat myself because I think in this pavilion we have already said, and notably the day before yesterday when we launched the Team Europe initiative, how important is the partnership between Africa and Europe. Africa is our neighbor, our destinies are tied. We cannot be prosperous if Africa is not prosperous. So this is very clear. And this is why the European Union allocates quite an important part of its development cooperation to Africa. Between 2021 and 2027, there are going to be 36 billion from the European budget destined to Africa. But I think more importantly, you said that this has been the year of the Africa Summit. I think that we've realized that with the classical development cooperation, the grants from the public budgets, we are not going far. And so at the EU-Africa Summit last February, the leaders announced an Africa-Europe Global Gateway investment package, which is worth 150 billion. And this is done together with all the European Union member states and the development banks, because development banks are essential to implement the investment that Africa needs, the big infrastructure. The Global Gateway is about green infrastructure, it's about digital infrastructure, it's about giving Africa that push towards the next level of development that is so much needed. But why we do the Global Gateway? It's clear that European Union and Africa are also united in their effort to tackle the climate crisis. And again, I don't have to repeat it here, how important it is. I don't have to repeat here how important adaptation is, how tragic the consequence of climate change can be. For example, people facing acute food insecurity has jumped in the Horn of Africa from 13 million in January to 22 million in September. So it's very clear that we have to do something. But I think adaptation is also a good investment in itself. The socio-economic benefits of investing in adaptation and resilience are very high. For every dollar invested in adaptation, we can have up to $10 of net economic return. And this is why to adaptation we have devoted one of our flagships of our collaboration with Africa. And on Wednesday we launched the Team Europe initiative on adaptation and resilience in Africa together with Denmark, France, Germany, and the Netherlands, and our partners from the African Union Commission. The Team Europe initiative will enhance cooperation with our African partner to further respond to their adaptation needs and mitigate disaster risks. And part of the announcement was also that in this budget, which is more than $1 billion in total, there will be 60 million from the European budget, which are going to contribute to avoid, avert, and address loss and damages from climate change. They will go partly to climate and disaster risk finance and insurance. Basically, we will allocate them under the umbrella of the Global Shield, and another part will go for early warning. But it's 60 million of new money that we hope will show once again the commitment of the European Union to address loss and damage. But this, again, is already been said. I would like to say a few words of our partnership with the African Adaptation Initiative. In fact, there's a direct link with the Team Europe initiative because the Africa Adaptation Initiative will be one of the partners for the implementation of the Team Europe initiative. One step back, why we support Africa Adaptation Initiative? There are a lot of elements that we like in this initiative. It comes from African leadership. I think when we talk about ownership, this is a very important element. It is coming for Africa, it is working for Africa. We also like its approach of focusing on the critical sector to address for the adaptation in each country. We also like the idea of transforming the national adaptation plans into investment plans. And I'm very happy to hear the good news that you just gave, that finally the operational plans are in place and that finally the initiative will continue to operate. We'll start to launch, let's say, its operations in a more, how can I say, in a more impactful way. And we will be happy to support you in this second phase of, I would say, of your life. Part of the Team Europe initiative will be a grant of €5 million to focus on enhancing access to the adaptation finance.
Grazie mille.
Thank you. And this is, I really, again, I'm really convinced that this grant is very, very relevant. The idea that with 5 million, we are going to enable organizations and public and private sector in African countries and regions to access the Global Climate Fund and the other multilateral climate funds is really, I think, a key on operationalizing the climate finance that we have put into the UNFCCC system until now. I have heard somebody here, I don't I've spoken to so many people, I don't remember who, but they told me, you know that to access the Global Climate Fund is like I have to fill in 150 pages. Well, we need to enable African entities to fill in this 150 or I don't know how many pages. So I would be very happy and I will follow very closely the evolution, let's say, the implementation of this grant, because I really want to see what happens with this 5 million. I know that we are not completely ready yet, that we'll sign next year. I am really looking forward to it, and I hope that when we sign, I don't know when, where we will do it, I don't know exactly how. I think this is DG Clima, so it will happen in Brussels. I'm looking at my colleague there because I don't want to say something wrong. But I would really like to use this occasion to make a little bit of an event of it and to give some publicity to this, because it's not that I want the publicity for the European Union, but I want the publicity for what you are doing and for the fact that it is possible to access the multilateral funds, that it is possible to enable the countries to address this capacity gap that I think is the key of the discussion that we are having now in COP27, and that perhaps if this train starts moving faster and becomes more efficient, perhaps it will also be, I wouldn't say the solution, but it will be a small part of the solution to the problems that we are discussing so much during these days at the COP. And I stop here. I don't want to talk too much, but I really wish you the best of luck, and I hope to continue to work together in the coming years. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you very much. And if I could, I always wear different hats as the AI coordinator. Make three quick points. The first one is of course, the global gateway. We are very happy as Africa and as AAI to be working on resilient infra. The African Development Bank tells us that in the next 10, 15 years, Africa will have to build anywhere from $100 billion to $150 billion worth of infra. And clearly that infra has to be made climate resilient. We already have started working as the AAI with the African Finance Corporation, which is the largest African multilateral institution on the continent in terms of private investment. We're working with them on setting up the first climate resilient infra fund. So we'll be very happy to sort of work with you on that point. That is extremely welcome. Second, on the Team Europe initiative pledge, and you have announced I think we heard yesterday the commissioner, the additional 60 million for loss and damage. I think this is really, really welcome. And let me share with you a little secret. In 2015, when AAI was launched, the mandate, and I quoted, the mandate from the African heads of state was to enhance concrete action on adaptation and loss and damage. And we have not reflected loss and damage in the initiative acronym. The initiative acronym is AAI, and the only reason the initiative was not called ALDI is because we were told that there was a supermarket chain in Europe which had the same acronym, so that we shouldn't be using ALDI, and that would create confusion. But again, loss and damage is part of the loss and damage and comprehensive risk assessment is part of the mandate of the AI. So we'll be very happy to work with colleagues on the Team Europe initiative, and we've already started on working on comprehensive risk assessment. And of course, finally, on the incubator, our new collaboration, wanted to already indicate that AAI and the Green Climate Fund and UNDP and other partners, we've launched the largest climate finance readiness program a month ago in Rabat. 23 African countries joined hand together in building not just pipeline, in building capacity, in integrating integrating climate models into macroeconomic models, and as well as looking at an initial pipeline assessment. So that 23 African countries coming together is where we will start looking at the portfolio for the incubators. And happily, last week we've had a conversation with the EIB, who informed us that they're tripling their adaptation finance target, and they'll be happy to sort of explore ways to work together. So this is really coming nicely together here. And again, thank you for all the support. We'll definitely keep you posted.
I'm very happy that you didn't call yourself Aldi, and not because of the supermarket, but because I think that it's better to have the loss and damage in your name. You're not here, you're here to prevent loss and damage. So I think it sounds better like this. We want adaptation, and with adaptation, I hope that we are going as much as we can to prevent loss and damage. So it's good like this.
Thank you. I believe that as well. Let's keep it to AAI, definitely. So we have now a video from our own UNDP Director of Regional Bureau for Africa. Auna was here, but unfortunately, we're holding this at the very last time, so she recorded a video for us. Can we hear Auna's and see Auna's video, please?
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I am sharing this message with you at COP27 at a time when some parts of Africa are hard hit by droughts, by floods, and by food insecurity, all of which are intensified by climate change, by COVID, and by the war in Ukraine. Today, I want to echo the United Nations Secretary General's call for developed countries, particularly the G20, to take the lead in accelerating their transition to net zero economies to avoid getting to a point of no return. It is our collective responsibility, really, to fight the climate emergency and to respond to this global crisis by delivering on our pledges to accelerate climate action. Adaptation is a moral necessity. COP27, Africa's COP, is branded Together for Implementation. And last week we saw developed economies joining hands in pledging more technical and financial support to accelerate adaptation action in Africa. The momentum is gathering, and the Africa Adaptation Initiative is at the center of this effort to coordinate climate action across the continent. As we charge ahead with implementation, there is a strong need for coordinated and concerted action. And the Africa Adaptation Initiative is the body that is entrusted by all the African member states to do just that. UNDP is proud to have been a strategic partner to this initiative since its inception in 2015. And I want to really thank the European Commission for the strategic partnership and support to Africa Adaptation Initiative. I also want to acknowledge the contribution of the government of Gabon to this initiative. UNDP remains committed to supporting African countries implement their nationally determined contributions, find innovative adaptation solutions to climate change, access climate finance, and also ramp up access to energy. Ladies and gentlemen, the truth is, we are running out of time. The State of Africa's Adaptation Report has just underlined the huge gap that still exists in climate finance. Today, as we discuss what is next for the Africa Adaptation Initiative, I really want to urge all development partners to rise to the challenge and step up investments for adaptation in Africa. We need to be able to avert what the SG has described as the climate hell.
Thank you, DG. Thank you, Auna. And I was there since day one. I was there since the very first contribution of the UN Secretary General through UNDP, which allowed the AAI to work on the heads of states mandate, and we came up with the first technical report. The support of UNDP and UNDP's leadership from Achim Steiner, even before he was the head of UNDP until today, has been unwavering. And we really want to thank all of you. Many are online from those time, from Pradeep, Srilata, Rohini, Julie, and Prakash. Thanks for the great support. Right now, there's a plethora of initiatives. It's even hard to count anymore. But in 2015, it was basically AAI, and we're only holding our steering committee a few days ago and opening finally the headquarters in Cairo. So thank you for all the support. Thanks for believing in Africa and for believing in us. This has been a wonderful journey. The best is yet to come. So shukran jazilan. Thank you, everyone. Next is a presentation on the State of Adaptation report. And it's very interesting because over the years, there have been many reports on the continent on adaptation. There's the UNEP GAP report, which is now going into the second or third edition. There's GCA, State and Trends. There's the UNECA. There are a number of reports. So we've been asked time and time, why do we need another report? So the State of Adaptation is not to be an over report. It has two or three very, very essential features. The first feature is Africans making an assessment of what is there. We're not writing just another. It's a meta-analysis, very similar to what the IPCC is doing. But only at this time, this is being compiled by African experts as Africans, as we have defined our priorities, not just in the UNFCCC, but as we have defined our priorities in our NAPs, in our NDCs, and other strategic documents. So that's first. This is a report which is owned and led by Africans. The second point is the only report which is then presented to African ministers for policy recommendations, and then to African heads of states for their policy recommendations. So we want the report to really not just inform policy making, but then its recommendations are presented to the experts, the ministers, and the heads of state to sort of come back and be influencing or leading or guiding implementation on the ground. So we're embarking everything which is there because only African experts can present to African decision makers for their implementation. So that's also a second point which is very important. And I would have to admit that it's a very gender and balance report. All the authors are women. So we're not doing well in terms of gender balance on that one. And only, I was told that gender is not just about women, but on this one, it's only women authors. And the two ladies here were going to present some of the initial findings of the reports and recommendation. We have Kulthum as the AI special advisor, and Jessica is online. Ladies, we're in your hands.
Thank you, Seni. Is this working? I cannot.
I think it's working.
Yeah, I can't hear it from. Okay, that's great. So thank you, Seni, for that introduction of. Firstly, the report. This is actually our flagship report. This is our flagship of the Africa Adaptation Initiative. In addition to what Seni has said about what makes this report different, it tells the African story. We are the ones holding the pen as Africans, which is quite different from the rest of the reports. Not to say those are not useful, they're extremely useful. And I think this complements all the other reports that are written, but this comes from the Africans themselves, articulating the African story in a narrative that supports our story as Africa. So that's one of the key issues that actually distinguishes this report from the rest of the reports. But also, in addition, when you look at all the other reports that have analyzed adaptation, such as the State and Trends, which are good, such as all the other reports, what we see lacking is an analysis around adaptation implementation. So we get a good analysis of adaptation policy, how we are doing with regards to policy, how many policies we have, and so on. But what we're missing, and this is something that we need to do more, is how we analyze the implementation. Because it's an implementation COP, we think this is key moving forward on analyzing the different sectors, how are we doing, where are the investments going, where do the investments actually need to go, where do we have a gap in terms of implementation. So a lot of analysis right now focuses on needs and gaps, but limited analysis on assessment of progress and implementation. And we hope that this report will highlight where the implementation aspects, gaps, and efforts and investments would need to go. So what is the purpose then, other than highlighting the implementation, but also it's important to learn where the lessons are in terms of good practices, in terms of gaps across Africa, in terms of even finance. And I'll talk a little bit about where we focus this analysis on and why we chose those areas of focus. So the report has identified sectors and thematic gaps that we need to analyze in the report for implementation of adaptation action. We specifically picked 3 sectors, which is agriculture, water, and coast. This is not to say the rest of the sectors are not important, but this was informed by African NDCs. These are the sectors that, if we look at the synthesis report of African NDCs, you see that these 3 sectors come top, but also because this is something that this flagship report is something that we would like to do every 2 years. So the next iteration of the State of Adaptation report, we will be touching on those very important issues such as infrastructure, I think that was talked about by Seni, health, and so on and so forth, which are key sectors. In terms of the themes, the report focuses on finance, technology, and comprehensive risk management. So finance and technology being sort of, if you're looking in the discussions, in the negotiations, these are sort of your enablers. So your means of implementation, and this is an area that has not been very well articulated, and we think it's important for the African story, to tell the African story when it comes to financing, what are the gaps, and you touched a lot about the gaps around financing. So this report needs to touch on that. But comprehensive risk assessment builds on the issue around loss and damage, which we haven't captured in the first phase of the AI. We haven't captured much around loss and damage. So this report identifies what kind of risk, comprehensive risk management we have in the continent and where the gaps are and where the opportunities exist. So in a way, this report sets out, after that analysis, it sets out an agenda for action, but very strategic. It's very strategic, high-level agenda, which will feed into, as was said earlier, into ministers and also head of state in terms of decision-making and accelerating implementation in the continent. As I said earlier, the report acknowledges that existing reports exist. Existing reports are there. This is not to replace the UNEP GAP reports and so on, but also to just complement it and provides that analysis moving forward. I talked about what the sectors are. This is how we structured the report. Perhaps let me take a break now and pause a little bit and tell you that what we're presenting is actually the summary of the findings. Now, we are developing the report, which we hope to launch the full report next year, hopefully COP28, that is the plan. But what this shows is when we started doing the report, we realized there's a lot of information gaps, particularly in areas that are important for the continent. For example, comprehensive risk management, in the area of social protection, we find that there's an information gap, because this is important for the continent to articulate where social protection should go, what kind of tools are important for dealing with comprehensive risk management, but that information is really missing. And it actually goes to the point that, at least if some of you have read or have seen the recent findings of the IPCC, that only 3% of research finance, research funds go to Africa. So you can see even the kind of information that we have access to is not shaped by African thinkers and African authors. 97% of research funding goes to issues that are outside of Africa. And that, in our view, explains why we don't have the kind of information that's needed to analyze some of Africa's priorities and African needs. So what we have right now is just the key findings, and the plan is to launch the detailed full report next year at COP28. I have my colleague here online. She's going to talk about some aspects of the findings, but I'll only deal with the findings related to finance, because I think that's really an enabler for climate adaptation. I think we're all here, we understand, I'll be preaching to the converted that we have impacts. It's particularly warming of 1.5, already impacts are there. Now at a 2-degree world, we are 1.5 to 2-degree world, we're expecting the results to be extreme. And of course, the greatest effects will be on economic growth on the continent. In fact, the IPCC projects that without climate change, our GDP would have been 13.6% higher. So we've lost about 13.6% of our GDP because of climate change. That issue around attribution has been made within the within the IPCC. So there's that urgent need for implementation of adaptation. And the IPCC, we use the IPCC a lot. I hope the IPCC authors here, they'll be very happy to see that we are using a lot of their findings. And it has already articulated that indeed implementation is lacking. When you look at where the funds go with regards to adaptation. Important for climate finance, and I think the text is quite small from here, or it's just my eyes. So important for finance, adaptation finance, is that there was an analysis that was done between 2014 and 2018, just to give you a flavor of where we are when we look at, thank you. That's much better. Just to give you a flavor of where we are when we look at adaptation finance, is that between those years, 2014 and 2018, adaptation-related finance was committed by bilateral, multilateral funders to African countries remained below 5.5 billion per year. And this estimates at roughly $5 per person per year. I like to look at figures because then you're able to really apply ourselves to look at what does $5 do for a region that's most impacted, $5 per year in Africa. And actually, it's less than $1 when you looked at the least developing countries. We were able to do that analysis. In terms of the needs, what are the needs? Because this adaptation finance flows need to match the needs. But unfortunately, we've got data gaps in terms of analyzing our adaptation needs when it comes to actually quantifying them. Only 24% of climate finance, total adaptation needs were quantified, and only 24% of that, it comes to 57.5 billion, according to our NDCs. So that means what we only know right now in terms of our needs is 24%. We don't know the remaining. So there's a methodological issue, there's a data issue that we also need to address, some of the questions that you were raising. When you look, and what importantly, particularly from the African continent, and also looking at how countries have been dealing with adaptation, is that almost 20% of our GDP goes to domestic funding of adaptation impacts. But recently, we've seen that the figure has gone from 2 to 9%. Again, we have a lack of data to be able to quantify this, but you can see that domestic finance plays an important role in addressing climate impacts and building resilience in the continent. But what we also found, when you now take a lens and look at the details of how this climate finance is in our countries, you see that it's not equally distributed across Africa. So highly vulnerable countries receive less finance than the rest of the continent. This really calls for the readiness financing to mobilize international climate finance. And you see that the largest investment gaps in terms of GDP are in Central and East Africa, which could range between 26 to 36%. But then more than half of all climate finance investments in Africa are absorbed by only 10 countries. So you can see the inequities that within Africa as well. But this, for me, it highlights the issues around access, the issues around capacity, the issues around being able to access funding that, one, already exists, but two, even other sources of funding that countries without support, without capacity need to have in the least in highly vulnerable countries. I will hand over to my colleague for the last 5 minutes to talk about technology and the rest of the chapters. Yeah.
Jessica, you're online?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear
Perfect.
you.
Thanks, Gulton. Thanks, Sani. The third chapter talks about technology development and deployment. And so we start off by acknowledging that technology can accelerate adaptation in Africa. And a starting point is the African countries' technology needs assessments, which are really clear about their technology needs. But we also find that there's an issue with the development and deployment of technology on the continent. And so even though we know that technology needs for African countries are in farm systems, in water systems management, and also in infrastructure, we only find that less than 1% of the world's patents for adaptation are registered on the African continent, which means that there's need for further structured and protection of large-scale deployment of adaptation technologies on the continent. But also the report also finds that there's increased use of digital technology in Africa, but this further requires regulations that incentivize innovation and investments. Particularly, we've seen that there's an increasing use of digital technology driven by efforts by both national governments, but also their development partners. But this use of digital technology offers great potential for countries and communities to respond to different climate change-driven risks, such as in the health sector, education sector, but also in the agricultural sector. We found evidence that showed that every dollar invested in ICT is reported to generate about $20 in GDP across the continent. But also ensuring that investments in digital technology grow, but also translate into implementation in adaptation requires that there's appropriate regulatory and enabling environments, which can ensure that there is first investments within the digital technology space, but also ensuring that these investments actually do translate into expansion across the continent to enable implementation of adaptation. A very good example here is the investments we saw in startups. In health sector startups in Africa since the pandemic. And so there's a report that found that there's about 60 startups looking at health sector needs in Africa, and those were mostly started immediately after the pandemic, immediately during the pandemic. And so we find that when there's a very good regulatory environment, when there is enabling conditions to enable investments, but also investments to grow, then we see a lot of innovation, particularly in digital technology, that actually translate into adaptation. Next slide, please. So here is another section is on comprehensive risk management in Africa, and we find that there's rising climate change risk, particularly in the current today. There's really high climate change risk for the continent, but also in 2030 we know that a rising climate change will mean that these climate change risks will be heightened. But that means that African countries will need comprehensive risk management mechanisms to address both current and future climate change risks. We observe that there's an expanding regional, sovereign, and national risk transfer landscape. For example, there's a solidifying landscape which is due to increasing collaboration between governments, domestic and international private sector, but also international development partners. And we see countries actually taking up different types of risk transfer instruments. For example, we have examples from Algeria, Malawi, and Morocco. But we also realize that these are not sufficient, and so African countries still need to employ a range of comprehensive risk management tools or mechanisms that involve risk layering, but also that pool the risk to ensure that there's comprehensive risk management, not just for risk response, but also for anticipation of risk and the management of risk. And so here we find that the current resources provided through sovereign risk transfer mechanisms are not sufficient. They're not nearly enough to enable the continent to respond to the diverse risks that it faces from climate change. And so there's a need to explore multiple other opportunities for risk pooling, both at the continental, but also regional and national levels to support risk management for the continent. Next slide, please. And then the chapter on agriculture is also quite interesting. And so we realized that climate change is also limiting agricultural productivity. And if you follow conversations on adaptation in Africa, we realize that agriculture is at the very center of it. But we've also observed that the domestic private sector has increasingly contributed to adaptation within the sector. And so agri-SMEs and investments within the agricultural sector are driven by the domestic private sector. And then this is mostly enabled by national governments. And so we're kind of just, giving a thumbs up to national governments who are significantly investing in the agricultural sector. But we also know that the investments in agri-SMEs are quite important, and there's need for financing to ensure that there is access to both capacity, but also finance and technology to enable the agri-SMEs to grow, but also address the need for adaptation in the sector. We also recognize that innovation is driving the adaptation in the sector, but also there's communities and households are engaging in innovative practices that are not really captured as innovative as being innovative at the international level, but they are involved. They involve local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, but also experimentation by households and communities to enable adaptation within the agricultural sector. And so whatever success we're seeing, mostly we credit that to households and communities and individuals. Next slide, please. The water sector is also quite important here. And so the report finds that climate change is already affecting the water sector in Africa. Particularly, we find that extreme climate events such as droughts and floods will negatively affect availability of water resources, but not just availability, but also the quality of it. And so, and these will have very significant effects on water-dependent sectors such as agriculture and freshwater fisheries. And so this will in turn affect agricultural productivity, industrial processes, human health and livelihoods. But also we recognize that one key area to enable quicker or accelerated implementation of adaptation is for financing investments in the transboundary resource management of transboundary management of water resources. And so about 90% of surface water in Africa is transboundary. And basically that just means that it's shared between, two or more countries. And this means that there's a very good opportunity for African countries to create mechanisms that share these resources in a way that will enable them to respond to not just risks in 2023, but also 2030 and further than that. But also this requires that the continent strengthens transboundary water resource management policies and institutions, but also the implementation of this policy. And there's need for frameworks and strengthening of of regional resource management institutions, as I said. But also there is need for climate resilient water resource management infrastructure. And so we found examples of infrastructure that is being implemented in pockets, but then this is still at a scale that is insufficient to respond to the increasing threats, particularly that which creates water scarcity. Next slide, please. And then lastly, before we talk about the agenda for action, we talk about coastal adaptation. And so coastal regions are really important for Africa. I think we found that a lot of the threats faced by coastal zones is from sea level rise, and about the rate of sea level rise for coastal parts in Africa has been higher than the global average, and so that we observe that from the IPCC report. And by 2030, more than 108 million people in Africa will be exposed to the risk of sea level rise. Most of this will be in large cities, but also rural areas that exist along those coastal zones. And these will just affect not just the livelihoods of communities, but also economies of countries. But beyond that is the need for continued improvements for regional coordination. And so we find that a country on its own cannot respond to sea level rise because it's affecting the whole coast. And so there's need for regional coordination to not just respond to sea level rise, but also to manage coastal resources that can act as infrastructure for protection against sea level rise. And so here again is where needs for transboundary resource management come up to strengthen the capacity to adapt to climate change risk across different coastal zones. And so we see structures such as the regional fisheries committees or the frontier conservation areas being quite important for implementation of adaptation in coastal regions. And then here, lastly, is the importance of nature-based solutions. And so NDCs by 21 countries, African countries, noted that they needed investments in nature-based solutions, which is quite important. But also our assessment by the report found that there's a very huge investment gap in NBS, in nature-based solutions. And so here we highlight that any financing that is concerned for climate change should also kind of prioritize the needs for investments in nature-based solutions. And then lastly is the agenda for action. I think, the first one is on urgency of adaptation at the national and regional and international level. As Colton said earlier, is that there's need for implementation, but it is not really reflected on countries' agendas, but also at the international level. And so we talk a lot about developing policies, we talk about identifying policy gaps, but not really about implementation. And so the continent needs to have a unified continental voice on the urgency to start implementation, but also to accelerate implementation so that the continent is able to respond to, as I said, not just current, but also future climate change risks. And so the urgency should be reflected in both not just national communications, national policies, but also in international communications. And so looking at NDCs, national level adaptation plans, but also ensuring that these give equal priority to both implementation, but also to not just planning for adaptation, but also implementation of adaptation. And then second is the need for more finance for implementing adaptation. The report finds that there's need for dedicated finance, at least scaling up of dedicated finance to address the translation of policies into adaptation. And here we also recognize that private sector financing is not a silver bullet, and African countries will still need to understand the specific context where private sector finance can be.
Jessica, is this the last slide? I'm managing time.
Yes, and then the last slide here is on the role of the potential for SMEs in accelerating adaptation to climate change, but also the need to strengthen integration and collaboration across the continent. And that's it. Thanks, Seni.
Oh, thank you. So we're really stopping on time. We have about 5 minutes, but really quickly on the state of adaptation report, the way we're seeing it here is really as both a knowledge product to be able to assess the gaps and challenges, but as well as track progress and opportunities, so that both the implementation and action on the continent is evidence-based, but at the same time, that the positions that a continent, for instance, take in global fora such as this one, is also rooted in evidence-based and science, not just in in any other way. That's quite important. So I wanted to thank again the UNDP and the EU for this work. This was our let's say collaboration 1.0, and it's frankly the fact that we have identified, for instance, finance as a need and access to finance in critical areas on the continent, as well as the key some of the nexus, for instance, agriculture, water, and energy for agriculture, which led us to work on this incubator, on this project preparation facility, to be able to work with SMEs, to work with those African institutions which are already accredited, but for some reason are not able to mobilize resources at the Green Climate Fund, at the Adaptation Fund, at MDBs as well, and even just in their domestic market. So thank you, ladies, and we'll try to do better on gender next time. But I'm very happy. This is a whole, African women team working on the report. Oxford University colleagues working in the GCF and Cape Town University. So we're very happy. And one thing that we also try to do at the African Adaptation Initiative is, to the extent possible, give an opportunity to African talent. So we try, to the extent possible, on all the work, to give the work to young and lesser young, like myself, African, to sort of really have an opportunity to use their talent. And same thing in climate modeling. If you see out the climate modeling team, this is all graduate from the WASCAL program, but they've never had an opportunity to use climate modeling in investments. So they're just at university. We're linking also science, policy, action, investment, so that they see the continuum, and we really break the silo. And some of them are very happy now and see how their climate model is not just informing policy, but is also informing investment and informing, for instance, investments in infrastructure, which they never thought that one day they'll be working with private equity investors in modeling to show them, how floods in part of the cities could be averted. And just yesterday, the city of Lagos launched its climate adaptation and resilient plan, and they have a $10 billion investment plan to sort of make the city of Lagos, which is the 5th largest, if you were to compare it as a country, is the 5th largest, the 5th largest African country in terms of GDP, in terms of population. So we're very happy to work with the city on seeing how we can help them to mobilize the resources, and as well use their experience to inform other African subnationals. This was very long. We have 2 minutes for final words from our panel. Your Excellency Said Al Rais.
Thank you very much. Really, those presentations were very enlightening, and you shed light on a lot of critical issues. And I'd also like to thank, of course, my fellow panel members for their interventions, and to really welcome all the partnership and support that the Africa Adaptation Initiative has been enjoying with the European Commission, with UNDP, with other partners, and also to highlight that during President Biden's speech at this very COP, he also announced that the United States would also be doubling its contribution to AAI. So all of these pieces are coming into place in at a very critical time, and it's very important that we move forward and implement, as this COP is for implementation. And thank you very much once again for the opportunity.
Thank you. So I think we're just finishing a minute in advance. We have a time for a group photo to maybe you want to? No, they're not. Okay, so yes.
I wanted to say something very quickly.
Yes.
The conclusion of the report said we need more finance for adaptation in Africa, and this we knew. But what is the use of the report, and all the work that you do is to tell us where we have to put that finance and how we have to manage that finance. So for me, this is very, very important. We know we need finance, but we need the information that you provide together with all the partners to know what we have to do with it.
Yes.
So, and to make it possible, most of all. So thank you. Thanks a lot.
And I can tell you that some of us have anticipated the outcome of the report, and that's why we need an incubator. Because from one side you have demand, which is telling you need finance. From one side you have supply, which is telling you don't have a pipeline. You need a market maker to make this happen. And that's what we're going to be doing in that program, to really have demand and supply addressing that element.
Thank you.
You have 0 seconds.
Yes, I have. But I think the point that you raise is an important one, and this is why we thought when we do the implementation analysis in terms of progress, it will direct us where funds are needed. But I just want to take a few seconds to just acknowledge the presence of my permanent secretaries that are here.
Of course.
Yes, I have from Botswana. So this is really important for the continent, and we can see the leadership of the continent. Permanent Secretary from Botswana for Environment, she's here. She wants to hear more, and Permanent Secretary also for Agriculture. So just to alert them that we are here, and this information, we hope it can be used at a very high policy decision-making level. Thank you.
And I can tell you that Kulthum is making us all proud, not just in the negotiation as G77 lead, but with the AAI. And some of us have been very interested in linking the world of whatever is happening in those rooms with what's happening on the ground. So we're very happy to as I said, to have Africans leading that. And thank you, Kulthum, and thank you, PSs, for making that happen. Thank you very much. This has been a very rich evening. So maybe we can get ready to take a picture before we depart. Thank you very much.